Under the glittering lights of a garden designed to celebrate love, a moment meant to symbolize forever was torn apart in seconds. What should have been a fairy tale proposal transformed into a public execution of trust, a carefully staged ambush that shattered more than just hearts. It exposed hidden alliances, buried lies, and the calculated cruelty of someone who had nothing left to lose. The night wasn't just about love, it was a declaration of war. And as the applause died and the whispers rose, the question wasn't who betrayed whom, but how deep the betrayal truly went. Under the shimmering lights of the elaborately decorated garden, where every detail was calculated to evoke perfection, the atmosphere seemed to be torn apart in the blink of an eye. Everyone had not yet recovered from the image of Bill kneeling down, holding the sparkling ring high before Dani's eyes, when a dark shadow suddenly glided out from the corner. Hayley appeared like a sharp fragment of the past that no one wanted to mention, messy hair, wild eyes, and a face distorted by a mixture of pain, resentment, and cold pleasure. No one had time to react when her scream rang out, tearing apart the applause, crushing the fragile romantic atmosphere that had just formed. The torn wedding invitation flew into the air like a piece of a promise, landing at Dani's feet, who was standing dumbfounded next to Bill. The banquet table exploded as Hayley walked in like a storm, followed by the sound of broken glasses, the sound of chairs falling, and the sound of people running in panic. In the chaos, Hayley's eyes never left Bill's, a look as sharp as a well-sharpened knife, not meant to inflict gentle pain but to tear apart any belief that had ever existed. The phone Hayley pulled from her pocket became the precise trigger. The screen lit up, revealing a video of Bill vowing on the beach on a moonlit night, where he looked into her eyes and said words that made a woman like Hayley believe they were real. Not long ago, he had spoken of a future, and now that future was in the hands of someone else. All eyes turned to Bill. In an instant, the man who had been the image of steadfastness and bravery had turned pale and cold. There was no more music, no more laughter, only the pounding heartbeats of those witnessing a public emotional execution. Dani couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't differentiate between what was real and what wasn't. She just stood there, like a puppet whose strings had been taken away. Hayley laughed, a twisted, monstrous laugh, no longer the laugh of a broken person, but the laugh of someone who had turned pain into a tool. But behind those violent actions was more than just blind jealousy. It was a plan. Hayley hadn't entered this garden by accident. She had calculated every step, every moment, every look, every flash of light reflected on the screen. She didn't simply want to ruin a proposal, she wanted to burn away the entire false curtain Bill had built. In the crowd, some trembled, some took a step back, some took out their phones to record everything. But there were also silent, observing eyes, as if they had been waiting for this moment for a long time. The whispers began to spread like a smoldering fever, touching every hidden corner of the people present. What Hayley exposed was more than a betrayal of love. It was a needle in the haystack of relationships Bill had so skillfully concealed. Inside Bill, a whirlpool of chaos began to erupt. Fear, shame, anger, all of it colliding, choking his breath. He knew the video was more than a moment of weakness, but proof of a truth he thought he had buried deep. Hayley was more than just his ex, she was the only one who could pull the veil back in front of this entire crowd. And she had just done it. Dani stood still, feeling the blood drain from her face. 100 questions rang through her head, but no answer was enough to anchor her to reality. Every moment of trust, every gentle look, every promise Bill had made, all of it dissolved like foam before the impact of truth. Hayley said nothing, she just stood there, letting what she had brought speak for itself. But there were deeper layers to this public collapse that no one had seen. Hayley had not come alone. Someone had helped her. Someone had wanted this truth to come out, just as Bill was about to move on to the next stage. And that person did not appear, but left traces of how everything had played out so perfectly, like a game that had been set up in advance. The question that quietly flared in the minds of those present, was Hayley just a woman reacting to a betrayal, or was she a pawn in a much larger plan? Was Bill a victim of his own making, or had he tapped into a force he had not expected? And the scariest thing of all, was this really the first flashpoint, or just the opening act of a series of blows? The flickering lights in the garden were no longer as beautiful as before. They had become cold, exposing the dark corners of the human soul. Hayley stood there, like a man who had just pulled a trigger, and Bill and Dani were thrown into a whirlpool from which they could not escape. And somewhere in the darkness, someone else smiled quietly. A game had begun. Questions hung in the air: who really controlled this game? Who ultimately benefited from Bill's downfall? And why did Hayley choose this moment to strike? The chaos of that night did not fade with the flickering lights of the garden. It lingered like the acrid scent of smoke after a fire, crawling into every corner of their lives. What began as a single moment of exposure, one video, one scream, one act of vengeance, had grown into something far larger than any of them could control. It was no longer about Hayley, or Bill, or Dani. It was about the chain reaction they had all unknowingly set in motion. In the days that followed, whispers turned into narratives, and narratives hardened into accusations. People who had once admired Bill began to step back, their loyalty evaporating like mist under the harsh sun of scandal. Business partners questioned, friends withdrew, and Dani, who had once stood at the center of his carefully crafted world, now looked at him like he was a stranger. The image of the proposal night, Hayley's distorted smile, the cold shock in Dani's eyes, the frozen silence of the guests, replayed endlessly in his head. But beneath the surface of humiliation, a colder, more dangerous current began to flow. Someone had helped Hayley, and Bill knew it. The precision, the timing, the flawless execution of the reveal, none of it was the work of a broken woman acting on impulse. Someone had placed that video in her hands, someone who knew exactly when to pull the trigger. And whoever they were, they had planned it not just to humiliate Bill, but to dismantle everything he stood on. Dani withdrew further each day. Her silence became a wall he couldn't climb. She didn't scream or accuse, she simply stared at him as though the man she had loved had never existed. That quiet distance was far more punishing than rage. She wasn't fighting him, she was erasing him. And deep down, Bill knew he had given her every reason to. Hayley, meanwhile, had vanished from sight as suddenly as she had appeared. No interviews, no statements, no public victory laps. She had detonated the bomb and disappeared into the smoke, leaving everyone else to choke on the aftermath. But her silence was not absence. It was pressure. Every day she remained quiet, the fear of what else she might unleash grew louder. Bill knew she wasn't done. And yet, what unsettled him the most was not Hayley. It was the shadow behind her, the unseen hand that had set everything into motion. Because in his world, nothing this precise ever happened by accident. Someone had waited for him to let his guard down. Someone had known the one weak point that could bring everything down. The world around him began to crack. Contracts were delayed. Meetings were cancelled. Rumors spread like wildfire, some true, some twisted beyond recognition. Former allies turned into opportunists. What he had built over years began to erode not with a single blow, but through a slow, deliberate dissection. And as much as Bill wanted to believe he could contain it, a creeping awareness began to sink in: this was not an attack to shame him. It was a war to erase him. But Bill wasn't the kind of man who surrendered quietly. Beneath the fear and humiliation, something else was beginning to stir, the cold, sharp instinct of survival. Whoever had set this trap had made one mistake: they had underestimated how dangerous he could be when cornered. He started tracing the fault lines. Every guest at that engagement night. Every movement Hayley had made in the weeks prior. Every business rival who had suddenly gone silent. He knew the answer was there, somewhere in the spaces between the whispers. And as the storm gathered over his reputation, he found clarity in the destruction. Dani's heart might have turned to stone. Hayley might have unleashed her fury. But Bill understood the rules of this new battlefield. It wasn't about love anymore. It was about power. And power wasn't lost in a single night, it was taken back piece by piece, with precision, with patience, and with the kind of ruthlessness his enemies had yet to fully grasp. Somewhere, far from him, Hayley stared at the same sky that had once heard his promises. The night had changed her, too. She had thought destroying him would free her. But freedom wasn't simple. It came with shadows she hadn't expected, with consequences she couldn't control. She had become both executioner and pawn in a game that was still unfolding. Dani lay awake at night, too. Betrayal does not end with a revelation. It grows roots, wrapping around the heart like vines. Her love had been sincere, but sincerity meant nothing against the weight of lies. She didn't know whether to despise Bill or mourn the version of him she once believed in. And in that fragile space between hate and memory, she too became a piece on the board. And somewhere out there, in the quiet spaces behind everything, someone watched. Someone who had engineered the timing. Someone who had set the pieces in place long before that night. They had no reason to hurry now. The damage had been done. The fire had been lit. The proposal night was not an ending. It was a beginning. A single moment of exposed truth had split their lives into before and after. What none of them yet understood was just how deep the rot went, how many hands were moving behind the curtain, how many secrets had been buried under carefully painted smiles. The whispers would not stop. The storm would not calm. And as each of them grappled with guilt, betrayal, and the thirst for retribution, their lives were slowly being pulled towards something far darker than heartbreak. This was no love triangle anymore. This was a battlefield. The question was no longer who had been betrayed. The real question was, who would still be standing when the game finally ended.